All right, chapter 5, how to multiply like a leader. In this chapter, we sort of go back to the story we find in the introduction. It tells the next part of the story, whereas in the introduction, there's a story from 2009 where the leadership team in Manila realized there's a problem. Basically, the church was multiplying disciples rapidly, but leadership had stagnated. Leaders were not developing. Leaders were being added very, very slowly while disciples were multiplying. And they were trying to figure out what was happening, what was the problem they needed to solve. And began looking back and really doing a lot of soul searching as a team, a multi-generational team, really thinking about what had happened. And they realized that there had been a point in the team, and you can tell the story further, but there had been a point where leadership and discipleship, training leaders and making disciples, had been the two pillars what they really drove on with the church for almost 2 decades. There was a point where they thought, we want to prioritize discipleship and make discipleship more intentional, and the thinking about the 4 E's of discipleship: engage, establish, equip, empower. That became the language of the church. And intentionally, they dropped leadership development off the slogan of the church, but leadership team assumed that it would keep going. But the intentionality of training leaders kind of fell off the map, and they realized that coincided with the point when disciples began multiplying and the leadership development was stagnating. And the real take-home from this chapter, and the take-home from those meetings 6 or 7 years ago in Manila, was that as intentional as we are about making disciples, we need to be equally intentional in training leaders.
I think for the first almost 2 decades of our church, I don't know if it was a mission statement or our motto was making disciples, training leaders, planting churches. That was printed on everything. It would have the name of the church, Victory, making disciples, training leaders, planting churches. But we went through a shift where we simplified our mission statement, our vision statement, and all that, and we went from making disciples, training leaders, planting churches to honor God, make disciples. But by simplifying, it not only disappeared from the logo and disappeared from the website and from the banners, it did start, the leadership development started slowing down. It didn't totally disappear, but it certainly started to vanish in a scary way. And you know, in chapter 3, we talked about the importance of listening multi-generationally and listening to the younger generation. And this was an example of that going wrong, because really we look back and it was listening to a younger generation, and they told us, and they said, look, our generation is not only not motivated by this phrase, training leaders, we actually run from it. And so we actually changed the names of our small group leaders from small group leaders to small group facilitators. And so we actually shifted gears for a few years to trying to make the word leadership disappear in some ways, but not the concept. But it seems that the concept and the word are closely attached. And so our leadership development really started slowing down. The discipleship continued to grow exponentially. And this meeting that William has referred to, that we write about in the book, was getting back to what did we do to produce a leadership culture, and how did we lose it? What we did, though, and what became the 4 I's of leadership development, it was an idea where we were saying we need to institutionalize the intuitive. And there were things that we did intuitively that created a leadership multiplication culture. We had developed a discipleship culture of the 4 E's: engaging the culture and community, establishing biblical foundations, equipping every believer to do ministry, and empowering every disciple to make disciples. So it was the 4 E's. That was very aggressive and very intentional, but our leadership development was intuitive. There were some of us who were doing things and we weren't exactly sure what we were doing, but people would visit our church and they would always comment on the number of leaders, strong leaders, men and women, and different generations of leadership, and they were always puzzled, where did you get all these leaders? Why does this church have so many leaders? And I didn't know the answer. None of us knew the answer. We were doing things intuitively and we weren't really sure what we were doing. And so this meeting, again, it was a multi-generational meeting, about 30 of us, trying to figure out what we did for all those years and what did we stop doing during that short season where our small group leaders started shrinking. And what we did is we were institutionalizing what at one point was intuitive. And when we had all these sticky pads all over the walls with all these words trying to describe how we got where we were, which was a really good place, then it seemed like they all folded into 4 categories, and it was identification, instruction, impartation, and internship. And that became what we tried to institutionalize in a leadership development mode, and those became the pillars.
And these will be fleshed out in individual chapters throughout the book, but obviously in this chapter it highlights how those are framed. Identification is both individuals identifying the gifts and callings that God has put on their life and growing in that assurance of one's calling, but also established leaders identifying potential leaders and saying, hey, it's sort of a reciprocal process. Hey, I think there's really something there that you need to begin to pursue. Instruction, in many ways, was just a way of boiling down the fact that people need to read books, people need to go to classes, people need to listen to podcasts, and all those more formalized ways we think about growing and learning, specifically as a leader. And those throughout the 30 years in Manila, there are a variety of ways that instruction happened. And then impartation, if instruction can happen at a great distance, listening to a podcast, reading a book of someone who's dead, impartation is something that happens face to face with another leader. So as the leadership team in Manila began thinking about how can we really look at leadership comprehensively, not just a class, but how can we help people throughout their leadership trajectories identify and continually hone in on what God has called them to do? How can we help them gain instruction and wisdom from classes and courses and books and different things? How can we get them in relationship with other leaders who can really impart things to them? And how can we get them sort of on-the-job training, interning, whether it's formal or informal, in areas where they feel called to lead? And how can we have that happening more intentionally in our church? When we begin thinking about that, we realized that there was a lot of work to do. And we realized that this was an exciting new way of thinking intentionally about leadership, but there's going to be a lot of work in instituting this and getting this back in the culture of the church, not just the few individuals who happen to be good at doing this intuitively, but getting everyone thinking on those terms.
Yeah. And speaking of work to do, as I read through and started to look at these 4 I's, I couldn't get away from this question. In your experience, has there been anything that you found to be more difficult amongst that process or these values of helping to develop leaders?
You know, Justin, I don't know if I can answer what's more difficult, but I can answer maybe which one is maybe has the most pitfalls. And I think it's identification, because I think it sort of, when it comes to leaders identifying potential leaders, there are 2 ditches that it goes to. Some leaders have such high standards, perfectionist standards, that no one really qualifies as a potential leader. No one's ever good. Of course, they've forgotten what they were and forgotten what they are now, selective leadership memory. But when they look at potential leaders, there aren't any. And I've seen a lot of pastors this way, pastors of small churches, pastors of large churches. I've talked to businessmen like this who can't find anyone who they think is a potential leader to even start working with. And that's the pastor who's always trying to hire someone from outside. It's kind of like Jesse with David, and we mentioned this earlier in a few lessons ago, how when the prophet was looking for the next leader, Jesse lined up all of his sons except David. And those closest to David saw 0 leadership potential in him. I mean, none. He was out take care of the sheep while we figure out who the next leader is. And I think there are a lot of Davids that we miss. So on the other hand, there's one ditch is the leader who sees no one as having any potential because they all have problems. The other one is someone who thinks everybody can be a leader. And then there are so many uncalled, immature people who don't even want to have any leadership responsibility, trying to train those, and then that goes nowhere. So I think somewhere in the middle of that is the ability to discern potential. And I think that's what we've always tried to do, is not find leaders, but find potential leaders, which is what I love about campus ministry. The future leaders of almost any industry you can name, whether it's finance or education or civil government or business or banking or the travel industry, or you just pick an industry, and the future leaders The majority of those are on the university campuses right now. I think that's the trickiest one. Instruction's pretty straightforward, impartation and internship, but it's that identification that we either open the door too wide or we just shut it and lock it, and both are mistakes.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what you were saying about leaders being on the college campus. That's primarily where I serve, is doing campus ministry. And I've definitely had the pleasure of discipling students who I feel could be leaders or who are potential leaders. So what does that transition look like from disciple making into leadership training?
You know, I think there's a huge overlap. And the same way that in making a disciple, when you're engaging, establishing, equipping, there's not like a hard line between equipping and empowering. It sort of simultaneously happens, and as I'm establishing foundations, I'm also equipping at the same time. There's a lot of blurred lines that overlap. I think as we make disciples, we're also bleeding into internship, for instance. You know, and I'm sure when you're doing a small group discipleship or Bible study on campus, there'll be times when you have a student who you're discipling, but then you have them start leading some of the group. Right. And so even while you don't wait, okay, I'm finished discipling them, now I'll start training them as a leader. It all bleeds in there that an internship is, more often than not, internship is informal. There have been times when I've seen people as interns and I just didn't tell them. And I would have them start doing some of what I was doing, like that. Okay, here's 3 points we're doing in the lesson tonight in this dorm. And I would ask the person, you do point 2. I wouldn't have them do 1 or 3, because if they mess up the beginning, it's tough to recover if they mess up the end. So let them do the middle one, and then you can fix it afterward. But it's an internship is on-the-job training. I think it's hand in glove. But I think what happened for us for that season, we focused so much on making disciples, we weren't conscious of the need to simultaneously develop leaders.
That brings me something I really enjoyed, or kind of a one-liner that I got a lot out of, is just this idea that all leaders are disciples, but not all disciples are leaders. So as we're talking about identifying future leaders or potential leaders, what are some indicators or factors that come in when you're looking for a potential leader? What are some of the things you look for?
Yeah, and that we'll get to that in a future chapter, but just quickly, we used to say we were looking for fat people, faithful, available, trainable. But that didn't go over. Outside of the Philippines, that was, okay, we need to change. So now we've upgraded that. We're looking for faith, okay? So we're looking for people who are faithful, available, involved. We're looking for someone already involved, like in youth ministry. Not an import from somewhere else, but someone already involved. That's your potential leadership pool. So faithful, available, involved. What's next? Faith. Teachable. Teachable and trainable. And we've talked about this a lot. If they're not teachable, they're know-it-alls, then I can't help them. They might as well go start their own thing, because they already obviously know everything. And then the final one is hungry. Somebody who's hungry for more, hungry to learn, and they're not content where they are, they want more. And so we're looking for faith, and that's sort of our guideline for who is potential. And I'll say something about that available point, because sometimes people have different seasons of life when they're available for leadership responsibility and when they're not. And I think sometimes we make the mistake with leaders, and we kind of make everything a character issue, and it's not. Sometimes it's just a circumstance of life issue. And that's why we say discipleship is 24/7. We're always disciples, we're always followers of Christ, but leadership is seasonal. Leadership is circumstantial, and there are times and seasons when people can carry a great leadership responsibility, and then circumstances change, and maybe they can't carry much now, but they will later. Yeah. Character issues are different. If there's a character fail, then that's a whole different topic, but I think we make a mistake when we don't pay a lot of attention to the availability part of that. Sometimes they're just not available because of the place they are in life, and if we demand too much of them, we're actually doing them a disservice instead of respecting the level of availability someone might have right now.
When you're looking at that, would you say all 5 are essential for a person, or would you say maybe they're faithful and they're involved and they're trainable, but either hunger or one of these other elements is either lacking or not there?
A good question. I think if I think teachable is always a deal breaker for me. I think if somebody's got everything else but they're not faithful, we can work on that for a while. If that doesn't change, then it's not going to work. If they're not available, we can work around that and figure out. I think that teachable one to me is I've had people who had all of it, but they just weren't hungry. Then vision, inspiration, motivation. Then suddenly hunger can be jump started. I'm not sure what to do with those who aren't teachable. That's my problem. The know-it-all, the one who already has mastered everything or thinks they have. That one's tough. But the others, I think we can work on them. But if a lot of those are missing, then find someone else right now.
So I have a question. How do we deal with, or how do we develop maybe a reluctant leader, someone who's expressed interest in leadership but is still kind of hesitant about going into these different aspects of the process?
Well, as a self-proclaimed reluctant leader, I know a lot about that, and I think for me, how do I say it? Most leadership situations I found myself in, it wasn't me signing up or volunteering. I was content at a certain level of leadership, and then it was usually the people around me dragging me further than I wanted to go. And I think about Rice Brooks and how many times he stretched my faith, challenged my vision, and really pulled me to a place of leadership that I would have been happy not to go there. I think it's important for us to surround ourselves with people who think bigger than we do, dream bigger, believe bigger, and are riskier. And they're willing to take these risky steps of faith and bring us along. And then when it's all over, we're leading in new areas and we're serving in new areas that really is because of the people that we've included in our lives. And I'm grateful for that, and I hope we'll all be that for someone, and also keep someone like that, not just someone, but multiple people like that in our lives.
And this is the challenge, and in many ways the endeavor of this book and the endeavor of the leadership in Manila, to build not just a discipleship culture, but build a culture of leadership and leadership development and empowering leadership where everyone begins to imagine things the same way. People begin to have this culture of going, oh yeah, God is calling not just those special people to be leaders, not just random individuals, but we're all walking toward leadership. We're all walking, because it's not about ambitious people getting positions. It's about people who Jesus has redeemed and given a calling to serve in a variety of different ways. And when you see leadership differently, when you frame leadership as leveraging all the influence you have and all the teamwork you have to serve other people in a variety of ways, then more people can jump into that culture and that imagination. Building that culture of leadership can make individual moments and relationships and decisions like that happen on a much wider level. But it takes a lot of intentionality, and it's organic. When it's organic, it's rare and special, but when it's strategic and really intentional, it can happen over and over and over and over and over. And that's what we're really hoping we see happen in the lives of people who read this book, but also in the story in Manila and what's going on there today.